Hello, and welcome to this week's Everyday Inclusion and Belonging, where we talk about everything DEI related under the sun. And there is a lot happening in the world of DEI, as we all know. So I'm super excited to be joined by, sorry, I was getting our view right, Susan Haley of OpenText. Susan, introduce yourself.
Sure. I look after we call it equity, diversity, and inclusion at OpenText. So I look after all of that. I happen to also be the head of recruiting and talent acquisition for the company. So I have that. I have a kind of a two-hatted role, if you will. And then within the recruiting world, I look after all of our executive search personally, because we have a lot going on with that. So those are my kind of three buckets.
So tell us first just a little bit about OpenText.
Sure.
And then I would love to hear sort of what you're up to, and even things like, was it always equity? Was that a switch that's been
Sure.
made? But first, just tell
Yeah.
us a bit about OpenText.
Yeah, so we are an enterprise software company. We were started in Canada at the University of Waterloo and have a big population in Canada. Recently, we moved our headquarters to San Mateo. We serve all kinds of large enterprise companies with their talent. Sorry, that's what I do with their automation needs, particularly content management. So we compete with companies like Box and IBM and kind of all the usual suspects. So we're 3 billion in revenue. We have 15,000 employees. We're in 34 countries around the world. We have a big population in India, about 3,000 employees in India. We really invested there on the development side. And we are just hitting our 30th year this year of being in business. So yeah, so that's who we are.
Congratulations. So let's just talk about what you're up to, right? How you are approaching equity, diversity, and inclusion. And out of curiosity, was that a switch that was made? I've seen that happening in a lot of companies where equity didn't even used to be in the alphabet soup. Uh,
Right.
and
Yeah. No,
now many
it's a great
companies.
question. It's a very relevant question. So I have been on board about 2 years. When I came in, I asked to take on, at the time we called it diversity and inclusion, just D&I, and nobody seemed to have a problem with it. So I got it. We didn't really do much with it. We had done some investment in programs for women, because I think it's clear, especially in a technology company, that women are definitely not represented. And so this is before my time anyway, but the decision was that we can all agree on women as a group that should be focused on. So there was some modest investment there, some good not really programs, but sort of good activities, if you will. And then what happened with us, George Floyd was murdered in the United States. Our CEO was deeply touched by that and deeply moved by all of the social justice that sort of resulted from that. And so I had been with the company at that point a little over a year, and I would say really hadn't done much with D&I, which is what we called it at the time. And then everything changed. We went on a journey with our employees. We did 5 listening sessions that we structured for our CEO. Even to the point of, I put a deck together that said, this is what a listening tour is. Like, you don't talk.
Yep.
Because, most CEOs, they're people that talk, and, we need them to talk. We need them to communicate, right? That's a good thing. But in this instance, it was like, they're not our employees, our Black employees in particular, in this instance, they're not going to talk if you take up all the airspace. So it worked really, really well. And, he was great. He basically said, welcome, listened, thank you. And then we took masses and masses of notes. We probably had about 70 people come together in 5 different sessions, 12 people each. So we kept them small so people could feel comfortable. Learned a lot, a ton. And that actually just got the ball rolling. So now we have a director of equity, diversity, and inclusion. It was through that process that our CEO really wanted to put equity first in the lineup. That's how we changed the name.
Yep.
When we asked, who should be the executive sponsor among our executive team, and we've got 10 or 12 people on that team, he said, me. I'm it. I'm the one that does it. So that has been fantastic. We set up a whole governance structure, and then just we are using the framework of impact teams. And so they're all volunteer. We picked a couple of topics that we felt were the ones that people really cared about. So recruiting being one, mentoring, our procurement policy, our investment policy, civic action, what we've done, because we do civic action every year. Where were we giving that money?
Right.
And as an example, like last year, we did it for food insecurity because of COVID.
Yep.
So this year, it's going to be really around internships for underrepresented
Right.
talent. So anyhow, we went from 0 to we have 1,200 volunteer employees now. This is in addition to their day jobs. We have 7 impact teams. We meet once a month with our CEO. We've expanded the EDI team. So the head of diversity director level, she reports to me, but she'll have 2 or 3 headcount going forward. So it's full on. Like we've changed the policies. I added an EDI recruiter that has been focusing on diverse sources of talent. We added a mentoring program. We now have 3 affinity groups. We didn't have any affinity groups a year ago. So now we have.
Which did you start with, Susan, for the affinity groups?
Yeah, so we have women in tech. That's our biggest. We probably have 700 members of that one. We have a B group. That's our Black employee empowerment group. And then we have probably about 150 in that group.
Okay.
And then we have a Q&A group, which is our LGBTQ group, and Q&A stands for queers and allies, so that allies feel welcome to be part of that. Actually, they're welcome in any of these groups, which is great. And we're now, because we're Canadian, we're actually dealing with some Indigenous issues in Canada.
Yes.
So that's probably our next affinity group, sort of an Indigenous peoples group that I think will probably have a lot of resonance in the US as well. But
Absolutely.
and sure.
Yeah. It's interesting. And this is the last few days of Disability Pride Month. And I'll just put in a plug that if you don't have an affinity group around people with disabilities, boy, the research just continues to stack up, and that is an underrepresented group. So there's my
it's funny. We do sourcing. We have a couple of sourcing groups that we source candidates from with the disability oriented groups. And because we're global, we actually have some countries where disability is a category for us to be very focused on. So for example, in France, we do a lot of work on this. Now it's not as broad as some of the other groups, but there's no reason we can't add more affinity groups. I think we just wanted to do a pretty good job with the first few that we did. And
absolutely. Well, and it creates a roadmap, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And I love, so let's go back to these impact groups. What are some of the wins or successes that you've seen coming out of those 7 groups?
Yeah. So, and the other thing conceptually is we didn't put them in place to be forever. We put them in place to solve a problem, and then they may disband and we could start some other topics. So one that's probably going to disband soon because they've actually accomplished their goal is our supplier diversity group. So we redid our supplier diversity policy. We're doing a few more tweaks on it and a little bit more testing, but I think when that's done, that's done. There won't be a need to continue with that. So, that's a focus that we, finished. Equally, we had one on corporate investment because we're an M&A type company, so we have big cash reserves. And we thought about investing in a minority-owned bank. So we did a lot of research on that. And unfortunately, we couldn't really find an organization that could absorb what we wanted to do. Yeah. So we've put that, we haven't disbanded it. We've kind of just put it on hold because there's not much more to do with it. But if some organization does come along that shows us, that this is not a risky investment, because this is essentially cash, we'll look at that. So that's sort of an example of one that we put on hold.
Right.
I don't think we'll ever not have a mentoring impact team, because that's all volunteers. It's everybody that raises their hand to be a mentor or to be a mentee. It's all volunteers. It's administered by volunteers. We have 2 people from our women in tech group that are doing it kind of part-time. And then again on, trying to think of some other ones, civic action, that may change its focus. Although in that case, it's starting out right now by being a program that's going to fund interns for us. And we have a college in Canada, a college in the US, where we're going to recruit interns. It'll start next May. Initially, it'll be funded by this sort of civic action group, but that's sort of nonprofit dollars, if you will. I think what will happen with that one is that will actually turn into a funded program
Uh-huh.
with proper university lens to it. And again, the start will be underrepresented students. And over time, maybe it turns into something else. But to start with, it'll be, and the two areas we're focusing on in Canada is Indigenous, and in the US is our Black
Yep.
population. So we have an HBCU we're in the process of doing a partnership with, the University in Canada, that got a very high population of Indigenous students.
What's interesting is if you wanted to thread that Indigenous to the US, Fort Lewis College uh,
Hmm.
in Colorado
Oh, yeah.
is their Indigenous. It, there is a wealth of young talent there.
Yeah.
I think what would be interesting too is thinking about how that internship and the mentorship um,
Oh, absolutely.
that group
100%.
start to play together.
100%. In fact, when I've been putting the program together for the interns, and and I've done this in past lives at other companies. One of the best practices is that they have a buddy. It's not their manager.
Right.
It's not even somebody in their department. It's just a buddy who can kind of help them navigate. And again, these are 4-month programs, so they're not here forever. But we want them to be meaningful. We want them to work on real projects. But the other place we want to focus in on is having mentors from our diversity groups. So. And that's why we actually want to get started on an Indigenous group. And it may be, it may be more allies in that group than actually Indigenous people, because, have to self-identify, and some are comfortable with that, some aren't. So that's fine. But we will definitely be drawing on those volunteers, employee volunteers, to help us with the students, kind of as a, one more touch point for them to feel like they've got a place to go, if they have questions or things are happening.
Well, and there's so much, there's some interesting research that I4CP has done that talks about having like those companies that are sort of next practices. They are helping new employees, whether, intern, or helping them navigate and understand how influence flows,
Oh, yeah.
what the different networks within an organization. We have as one of our best practices for teams, any new employee that comes in should absolutely have somebody that, those first months, you're trying to figure out the acronyms, you're trying to figure out everything. And
Right.
for somebody to have somebody that is helping them navigate all that is so powerful.
Exactly.
Susan, I'm interested, and I want to dig in a little bit more on the mentoring
Mhm.
impact group. So everybody, that all of the research around sponsorship really being the secret sauce
Mhm.
to moving up in an organization. So I hear you saying mentoring group, and I'm guessing that there's actually some sponsorship that's happening
Oh,
there.
yeah. 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 I mean, and I think, mentoring is kind of an interesting concept, because sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes the match doesn't work, or people's needs change, or, roles change, or whatever. But I think we found, because we ran this out of the women's networking group, or the women's, we call it WIT, Women in Tech.
Yeah.
They are by nature, and a lot of them are coming out of our sales organization. So they're by nature closers, and they want to move people to the next level, and they're like, don't fool around here. I can give you some advice, but what are you going to do next? And how are you going to do it? And how can I help you do it? And then I just think you're right. They kind of move together, but I think if you're being a good mentor, for the most part, you're probably a good sponsor. You're
Yeah,
probably
right.
sponsoring, because,
Yeah.
you're trying to help them navigate. And the sponsorship part, like I was talking to one of the people yesterday, or yeah, yesterday. She's happens to be in HR, and she's got a very thorny issue she's working with, that I'm actually on the other side of, in a good way. We're trying to make it happen together. And I finally just said to her, okay, Alexis, this is how you need to do this, because
Yep.
you're going to be ahead of HR someday. She's an HR business partner. I said, you're going to be ahead of HR someday. You're going to see one of these. And this is the context of what you're dealing with.
Yep.
So even though you've been asked to do this, this is the situation. And I'm here to help you figure out what to do and what not to do to
Yes.
get you through this.
Right.
And because you're going to see, this is just a sophisticated problem you haven't seen yet, probably in your career. In fact, I know she hasn't because it's a step up role that she's in. So I look at that as sponsoring, not mentoring. I look at that like, you're going to be here, so let's get you through this little knothole or big knothole with as much information so that you aren't guessing what the heck is going on in somebody's mind, because I can tell you what's going on in the mind.
I'm not just positioning you to be successful. I'm ensuring that you're
I
successful.
am ensuring you're going to be successful. And you call me if there's any question as you're kind of going through this. And I'm not trying to micromanage her because she doesn't even work for me, and I'm not even trying to micromanage the situation because things can change, but I can absolutely give her the reality of what's happening here that isn't obvious, frankly. And it's just not, I mean, I know when I was growing up through my career, I would see these situations go, what is going on?
Right.
There's stuff I don't know. And to me, context is everything. Actually, that's probably the biggest thing a mentor or sponsor can do is give you context.
Yeah. Yeah. That context. And then also like, how am I opening doors? Right.
Yeah.
How am
Yeah.
I helping them be successful in those critical
Right.
junctures in a
Right.
career? And
That's
then how am I recommending forward?
right.
I love that you have salespeople like, I got to close, got to
Oh,
get her.
they're the best.
I love it. Uh,
Right.
what are some other, anything else that you want to share? Because this has been just a wealth of information in terms of how you all, and
Yeah. I mean,
kudos.
one thing I would share is one of the impact teams is all around data and
Mhm.
information. And as I don't know what our audience is, but most people know that in the United States, you're required to ask about ethnicity. You're not required to answer. Okay. In Canada, I don't think it's required to ask it, but we do ask it. In the UK, we ask it. South Africa is the only other country that you're required to ask.
Mhm.
And what we've learned, and our CEO is a former developer, programmer, quantitative type person, he's like, I want to know the specific numbers. And we're like, Mark, people aren't required to answer these questions. So we can't give you, unless we do a head count, like literally walk around offices and say, make some judgment on what somebody is, which is actually what a lot of companies in the US do when they have to get more specific data. So it's not a great process. So one thing we've done is we've encouraged everybody to fill this information out. We've not required it because we can't and we won't, but we've been like, we really, the more we know, the better we can deal with pay equity issues, for example, that do
Yeah,
impact
yeah,
people. And
yeah.
that would be a good thing. So we're really trying to encourage people. But the other thing we've learned, and because we're in 34 countries, we're looking at our 10 top countries and trying to figure out what the right ethnicity questions are, because they're different. In the UK, it's different than France, let's say, or Germany, or India, or Philippines, or Japan, for example. So these are like our big countries.
Right.
So we're right in the process. And we've learned, one thing I've learned is that nobody's doing this. Not even the big consumer companies that you'd think their customer set would, they'd want to, resonate or represent the customers. They're not doing it. It's a very, it's just something nobody's touched.
Right.
We're touching it, and we're actually, SAP is our vendor for our HR system. So we're gonna actually talk to SAP about co-developing a product that
Awesome.
could be available. You don't have to get it, but it would be available to companies that want to get a deeper understanding of what their diversity looks like. Because like I said, the diversity in India is completely different than the diversity in Japan or the Philippines or wherever. So, and those are important groups for us. I mean, like I said, we have 3,000 employees in India. I mean, they're not all the same. I mean, obviously we can agree on men and women, but you kind of dig underneath that, there's still stuff going on. So we're trying to take this to the next level.
I love that. And it's one of those things that just because something is complex
It is
doesn't mean that it's not worthy to
right.
right, dig in on it, because until you can really measure and understand, it's very hard to improve.
Well, and I don't know how much time we have, but I will tell one quick anecdote, because this is not only complex, it is difficult. And it is difficult, for example, like in France and Germany, we spoke with our HR colleagues. These are people that work with us on our team. And both of them said, and this is maybe instructive for people to know this, both of them said that if we meaning OpenText require them to implement a plan that goes after diverse information on their employees, they will quit. It's that loaded a question in some of these countries that have had, their historical issues and have spent years, decades. We are one France, we are one Germany. So, Americans coming in with this sort of notion is quite difficult. It's difficult. And so as we've laid this all out for our CEO, we've laid out these risks and said, look, can we do it? Yeah, we absolutely can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Do we want to do it? And do we understand what risks we're taking if we do it? Here they are.
Yeah.
Maybe we're willing to, maybe we're not. So it's an absolutely complex, but beyond complex, it is a very difficult subject.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is inherent in so much of this work. I was talking with the company and in our pulse surveys, we when folks are deciding whether they want to ask some demographic questions, we say, I will tell you from experience that people will skip those. How can you ask that question in a way that you're still getting the information? My race impacted how I answered this survey, positively, negatively, right? So you're not asking people necessarily to identify, but you're finding out, wow, people's gender identity or their race or their, any number of things that you want to, then you can get in there and say, we've got some issues. Now we need to, as one friend in this work said, then we can get in there and double click.
Yeah.
And find out what's going on.
That's right.
But you have to ask it in a way that people are willing. And then, for example, I had somebody say, people just won't self-identify that that they have a disability. So we have to make it more comfortable for them. And I said, that's actually the wrong question. The question is, why are people not comfortable identifying?
Yeah.
Right? What culturally then?
Well, yeah,
right?
and the why is an interesting, because we asked our Black employees about this, and all of them said, literally, they said, there's going to be no good that comes from this for me. And so why bother? Like, the history would suggest, especially in the United States, that having this information out there isn't going to help me. So if I don't have to answer it, I'm not going to answer it. So we've spent a lot of time with, especially with our Black employees in our B group, basically saying, in fact, some of the leaders of that group have said, I love OpenText so much, and I know this company has its heart in the right place, that I'm going to answer it. Because this is not going to be to make my life difficult. It's actually going to be for us to do better things. And like I said, examples would be pay equity, which, we really can't get into that except for women and men. But even then, it's not always that clear. So, I think we have to just think about it. What's in it from the employee perspective, and be very honest about that versus, I don't know. I don't know.
Right. Asking it for some sort of report versus ongoing demonstrating a commitment to equity, inclusion. Yeah.
That's right.
I knew this was going to be a good conversation. I feel like we could go on forever. And I'm going to ask you for one last truth bomb.
Okay. So this is my truth bomb. If you're working on this type of topic in your company and your CEO is not engaged, leave the company and go work somewhere else. Because if the CEO is not engaged, it is a waste of time to do this work. And I mean that with all my heart. Because the work is fantastic. The work needs to be done. And there's lots of CEOs out there that think this is the most important thing, and go find that CEO. But if you're doing it in a company where it's kind of an afterthought, leave. So that's my truth bomb.
I love it. And that is a perfect way to wrap. Susan, thank you so much for sharing your brilliance.
You're welcome.
All the great programs you have going at OpenText. Kudos. Because when I look at what you've done in a
year ago, I would tell you none of this existed. And that is the truth. Nothing existed except me with a title that said D&I. That was it.
Well, and I think that's to go from there to CEO, executive sponsor, everything, commitment, these programs. This is a journey. And I think that you all started your journey in a sprint. That's
Mhm. We did.
now that's now sort of a sustainable marathon. And I would say to those of you that are watching, this should give you hope that if you don't have much in place, with a supportive CEO, back to Susan's truth bomb, you can get a lot done.
You can get a lot done.
Thank you, Susan, and
Take
everybody.
care, Mo.
We'll see you next week.
Everybody.